Supernatural, Episode 4. Shapeshifters. They started dancing in circles around her, while the crowd's chanting and drumming grew louder and more intense yet again. She noticed their body movements were so unnatural despite their elegant grace and smooth transitions. It was as if they were flowing like water or floating in the air just above the ground. She let out the most deafening shriek of horror as they started transforming before her very eyes. Their limbs were sinking into their bodies until their ears disappeared, followed by their necks, their arms and legs, until each of them became one big, long, curvy, cheap shape. She was panicking and screaming while covering her eyes and ears. She couldn't remember a time when she had ever felt that petrified. She cried and tried to find a gap in between the circles they had formed around her, but in vain. She crawled back to the center, begging to be set free, but knew that was not going to happen. They then dropped onto the ground, fully transformed into snakes. The coloration of their skin patterns matched the colors of their hair, eyes, horns, and tails they had while in their humanoid forms. A mix of black, blood red, and white. She started falling in and out of shock, being completely quiet and still for a moment, then screaming and trying to escape the next moment. They started crawling towards her from every direction. Eventually, her poor, fragile body could no longer withstand the shock and horror, and she lost consciousness for a few seconds. But that did not stop them. They started crawling on her naked body while she lay unconscious on the ground. Then she came back to herself to find they were all over her, slowly but firmly wrapping their bodies around hers. One around her neck, others around her breasts, her waist, thighs, knees, ankles, toes, arms, and her wrists. Basically, every joint she could potentially move. The most horrifying ones were those slowly crawling on her face and wrapping around her head, covering her eyes so she could not see any light nor feel safety or comfort. Also, covering her mouth, depriving her from being able to express her overwhelming horror by screaming or crying for help. While some firmly wrapped around her, leaving her completely helpless, others roamed around her body, exploring it like a bear toying with its prey before gobbling it all up. She then felt their long split tongues and their teeth all over her body. It was horrifying, but so confusing. She had these weird, intrusive doubts in the back of her mind that she might be enjoying it all, which she wasn't sure how to feel about. They caressed her body, massaging it with theirs. They licked her, they bit her, they sucked on her nipples, ears, fingers, and toes. Then two of them started crawling between her legs, not stopping at where they joined together. They continued to crawl until they were inside of her, filling her up completely, while another did the same to her mouth. She was completely invaded by them as they continued to violate her body in every way unimaginable. She forgot all about her fear and horror. She could no longer think straight. She was having the most intense dose of pleasure that she could die right then, satisfied and content. She lost track of how many times she had orgasmed, but that didn't matter the slightest. It was like pleasurable torture. She was completely drained of energy and will, but she didn't resist it, as it all just felt like heaven. They crawled out of her and unwrapped themselves of her body. She lay there motionless, watching them with heavy eyes, transforming back into their humanoid forms. They then laid around her, cuddling her in every way they could. She fell asleep, or lost consciousness, or maybe both. It was very hard to tell the difference between the two at that point. She woke up in some sort of bath, with a few of them bathing her. Once they were done with her, they took her back to the very spot she was previously whipped at. The couple were there sitting at their throne watching intently. She could see all of the crowd's faces this time, as none of them had their hoods pulled up, and she was not surprised to observe that they all looked the same. She could no longer feel or hear the hostile vibes from them that she had felt before. Although they didn't say a word to her, somehow she heard thoughts, or rather messages in her head. She understood they had no intention of tying her up this time. She must consciously and willingly choose and get through this particular ritual herself. They laid her down on what seemed like a platform, with the soft animal hide underneath her. They started writing or drawing on every inch of her body. They used sharp, thin tools that pierced through her skin. They were kind of like tattoo guns. It was painful. She moaned, groaned, and whimpered as they kept going. It seemed to have lasted for hours and hours. She lost consciousness a few times because of the pain. Once they were done with her body, they moved to her face. They drew or wrote all around her eyes, her eyelids, her lips, even on her tongue. They then moved to her neck, which they seemed to have given special treatment. They drew a ring around her neck and went around it a few times. They then finished at the very spot between her legs. She laid still while the crowd finished their chanting. Once they were done, the couple stood up, took off their capes, and stood facing one another. She checked for tails but saw none, which she found confusing. She checked for horns, but they were absent too. While she tried to make sense of that, they walked towards each other and hugged. Then they started merging into one. She was still not used to the whole merging and transforming sights, so all she wanted to do was spring up, scream, or flee. But she couldn't do any of that. Instead, she lay motionless, watching in disbelief. Once they were completely merged, their horns appeared, as well as their tail. They matched the others in shape and color, but were bigger in size, which made sense. They then walked down what appeared to be a set of stairs towards the platform on which she was laying. They leaned forward and kissed her long and hard. She could feel their long tongue deep in her mouth, wrapped around hers. This time she kissed them back. She wanted more. She never wanted them to stop. She wrapped her arms around their neck, and they climbed onto the platform alongside her and made love to her while the crowds watched and chanted. When they were done with her, she had completely forgotten about her pain and was high on the pleasure she had received. They cuddled her, and while they did, they transformed into a snake twice the size they were in their joint humanoid form. She was scared, but her desire to stay was far more superior to her fear. They then wrapped themselves around her body tightly, covering it up with theirs. She was not sure whether that was to be sweet and protective, or to simply mark her as their territory. She fell asleep. When she woke up, they were bathing her yet again. This time it didn't seem to be a part of a ritual. Once they were done, they dressed her in one of their capes. She understood that she was being prepared to return to her world. She could no longer see any writing marks on her body, but through the mirrors that were scattered everywhere, she could see the ones around her neck were still there. It was as if the rest of the marks were either temporary or they had disappeared, but she understood that they were still there, just not visible to her eyes. She realized that her questioning thoughts were being answered by her companions through telepathy, and that they could hear her thoughts. She was taken back to the couple so they could do some sort of test before she left to go back to her world. She had no idea what type of test it was. She was therefore nervous but also intrigued. She hoped it was nothing painful nor scary. They stood her before the couple. They were in their joint humanoid form. They gave commands to her through telepathy, like sit down, stand up, eyes on the ground, which she obeyed, feeling slightly undermined, being treated like a pet. Then she could hear further commands, but this time her body was obeying them on its own. She had absolutely no control over it, so naturally she tried to resist, but when she did, the written collar around her neck tightened and it became hard to breathe. She gasped with shock, but her lips got sealed. Her wrists joined each other, as did her ankles, and she dropped to her knees. Then her eyelids shut closed. Despite her panic, she caught up on what was going on. She realized that this was a test. They wanted to make sure they had full control of her body and full access to her thoughts. She now realized that the rituals were some sort of master-slave connection, and that she no longer belonged to herself. Instead, she completely belonged to them. She heard the couple's voice in her head saying, "You passed the test. Now leave us. Go back to your world and await our commands." She walked towards the thick, liquid-like exit. She then knew that she had to cross on her own. She passed through the seal to find herself back in her bedroom, which was exactly as she had left it. The pet cage was there, with its door wide open, the candles, the faint lights, everything she had set up the night she left. It felt like forever ago, which made her very curious as to how long she was gone for. She looked at her alarm clock and realized she was gone for 3 whole nights. She decided to take a bath and get some sleep. She laid in her bed, recalling all that had happened over the past 3 nights, which she had spent in the other world, visualizing and reliving certain moments made her feel very horny, that her hand made its way down between her legs. But to her surprise, something very unexpected happened. To be continued. Cleopatra.